coming to tonight's faculty research presentation, Avoiding the Chaos, Rationality of Preventive Measures for Lasting Peace. I'm Dawn Emslem, the Director of Library Services. Today, I'm looking forward to welcoming Dr. Yvan Ilunga. A few notes before the presentation. Please feel free to help yourself to snacks and drinks after the presentation. For students studying around us, we're happy you're here. Please listen in and respect our speaker with silence during his talk. Dr. Ilunga will share for about 45 minutes, followed by questions. Then we'll have time to visit and partake of more snacks and drinks. Now let's get to know our speaker. Dr. Yvan Yenda Ilunga serves as Associate Director of the Master's Program in International Relations and Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Salve Regina University. He is also Deputy Director of the Joint Civil-Military Interaction Research and Education Network and the initiator of the African Wars in the 21st Century Project. With his research agenda broadly focused on international relations, peace operations, security, peace, and development, his most recent published work includes the book Humanitarianism and Security, Trouble and Hope at the Heart of Africa, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2020, and the book chapter Peace Leadership, Security, and the Role of the Military in Ethnopolitical Conflict, published in the Routledge Handbook of Peacebuilding and Ethnic Conflict. I had the pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Ilunga last week to talk about his research interests and how they tie to his experiences of his growing up. He grew up in Kolwezi, one of the largest cities in the Democratic Republic of Congo and a center of the DRC's mining industry. In our conversation, Dr. Ilunga noted that most of the infrastructure in Kolwezi was designed, maintained, and run by the mining industry. His mother, before retiring, was a nurse in a hospital run by the mining industry. His father, before retiring, was a mining engineer. And Dr. Ilunga and his siblings went to a school run by the mining industry. The mining company was a state-owned company. He observed that the mining industry impacted everything about people's daily lives. The city design was based on social class, which was determined by your position in the mining company. Location and type of housing, access to education, medical care, and food were all determined by social class and position within the mining industry. These early experiences came to impact Dr. Ilunga's perceptions of his country, the legacy of colonialism, and the position of the DRC in world affairs. He notes that after the DRC achieved independence from Belgium in 1960, the dictatorship replicated the existing economic and industrial systems. After 32 years of dictatorship in 1997-1998, the politics of the country changed, and he observed how liberalization of the economy and mining sector brought new economic interests, but also opened up the country to violence. Dr. Ilunga was in high school when the Civil War began, and he remembers that the revolutionary movement recruited child soldiers. He and his brother planned to join the movement, but his parents forbade it. Later on, the family moved to Lubumbashi, the second largest city in the country, where he enrolled in college at the University of Lubumbashi. In determining his course of study, his main consideration was how to move his country forward, and he decided to major in international relations. While he studied the current political situation of his country in the context of international politics and history, he observed the UN peacekeeping mission in the DRC and saw the disconnect between high-level policy and local needs. With this in mind, he moved to Cape Town, South Africa, to study development and came to the conclusion that change happens at the grassroots and that for international policy to be effective, it needs to be grounded in local policy priorities and practices. With this perspective and experience, He knew his angle and was confident in his understanding, so he came to the U.S. for his doctorate and fellowship, which then focused on conflict and natural resources. His work led to his Ph.D. in global affairs from Rutgers University. In his teaching, he says it's important to him that his students not only learn the theories and become excellent critical thinkers, but also that they understand how to apply what they've learned, that their work is applicable and relevant. And I believe that he's going to address some of this in his talk today. Join me in welcoming Dr. Yvan Yenda Ilunga.
Great, good afternoon, everyone. I hope the mic is on and you can hear me well. Great, thank you very much. I'm excited and very grateful to be sharing some of my research on what I consider to be current global affairs, global issues, with a touch on academic side of it, because sometimes we as scholars tend to remain in our books and forget that our books should reflect the real world, or sometimes we try to bring the real world in our books and not create the right connection. And yes. How about this? Much better? Or I can use the other one. Yeah, I think I can manage. How about this? Great, thank you. Actually, thank you for helping me to avoid the chaos, because I could have been talking through and not realizing that you're not hearing me. But sometimes that's what happens too in politics, right? You have politicians and policymakers design policies and tell us things, but the reality is that there is that disconnect between what they think and what we experience. So you just make this talk complete. But I would not state so much on what is not working, but I think that could come as part of the conversations. But I'll try to suggest some ideas of what can be done in a way that as society, at national, international, or local level, avoid the chaos. And this presentation is very much first a question and a reflection on what has been observed internationally since 1945, with, of course, the creation of the United Nations. And two is a conversation and a reflection of what has been observed in places where the United Nations has deployed. And three is a conversation that will focus mostly on what can we do together as global and international community to avoid certain crises from recurring, or to avoid certain crises from occurring. And avoiding the chaos is a reflection, but it's also probably a wake-up call on what we observe today around the world from the developed countries as well as developing countries. On the developed countries, when you think about what's happening in the United States, in terms of institutional dynamics, one may wonder if institutions will survive, or if the people who benefit or receive from institution could continue benefiting from it. But it's also a reality that is happening in places such as Haiti, where you don't have institution in place, and people are trying to come out of the crisis with a projection of what institution could look like. Of course, the international opportunities and the community tend to think of building institutions as the first framework of stability. But it's also a conversation that reflects what's happening in places such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, where you have institutions in place, strong, relatively weak, depending on who interpret them, but the people believe that change should occur. But how can we work with existing institutions to build strong countries? And the same conversation may be reflecting on a country such as Rwanda that has built institutions, but now one can wonder if individual leaderships will sustain institutions over time, or if new leadership will keep the same vision that has occurred since 1994. So this is some of the conversation, or elements of the conversation that I wanted to try to cover today. So there are certain theses, or at least my thesis on why we should avoid the chaos, but also why preventive measures are important, is that lasting peace is not produced by crisis response only. It is prevented into existence by everyday institutions that reduce vulnerability before violence escalates. So, if you want me to share the slide, I will later on, but I want to talk a little bit through current issues. So in 1994, as we all are aware, the United Nations was created, 1945. The United Nations was created with the aim of establishing and maintaining global order and stability. But that approach was unique because it was at institutional and state level. And the idea then was to stabilize the world based on the possibility of interstate conflict, not reflecting on what local communities not identified by the international community as states are facing. So the approach since 1945 of peace and stability and long-term development was a state-centered development. Of course, that was successful until we start observing intra-state conflicts. And these intra-state conflicts, unfortunately, were not in the UN-based framework of peace building and peace operations. And I'll explain the difference later on between peace operation and peace building. So the framework that was set back then was not a framework that would allow for the international community to help and advance stability within countries. But it was very much a framework that would sustain the effort of peace building between states. So now imagine if there is a country A that is fragile internally and you have civil war occurring in the country. So the international community did not have a proper framework of addressing it based on the approach that was established in 1945. So the struggle that we have today of state building in many countries is not the unwillingness of states and people and the leadership to address the crisis, but it's also the unfitness of the institutional and international legal system in how to address type of crises that are occurring in and within countries. I'll just give another quick example. We talk about terrorism, right, as one of the growing activities and radical movements around the world. When it happens as a cross-border activities, it's easy for states to say we can address it. But when it starts occurring within the country, the international community may struggle to address it because it's something that was not initially within the framework of international peace and stability as designed and promoted in 1945 by the United Nations. So we start having those challenges observed, and unfortunately, because we have not grasped the framework of addressing them at the internal or intrastate level, we still try to build institutions at the national level and miss the issue at the local level. So under this research that I started many years ago and very much getting to the last stage of it with the first full draft ready to be submitted to a journal, I argue that peace and long-term stability does not depend on institutional building only, but it requires preventive measures. And these preventive measures are at 4 levels. One is preventive measures that will focus on building education. 2 is the preventive measures on ensuring health system. And the third one is preventive measures on looking at the type of justice systems but also the leadership within this justice system. So justice becomes the third pillar of these preventive measures. And the fourth one is public safety. Let me start with the fourth one. Yesterday, the South African government, President Ramaphosa, gave an interesting speech. I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday. But in his address to the nation, he said, we have to deploy the military to neutralize the gangs in a certain part of what is known as the Western Cape, in the Cape Town area, because there is a growing activity of gangs that requires neutralizations. So this is a public safety issue, but with a deployment of the military. Historically, these were questions to be addressed by the police. But why is it important to address these concerns of public issues or safety with the military? So you start having that relationship between the civil space with the military space involved. And these are type of crises. And this is not new and unique to South Africa. A few weeks back, or a few months ago, we observed the same trend here in the US with the deployment of National Guard in Chicago, the deployment of National Guard in Las Vegas, right? Or Los Angeles, the deployment of National Guard, or at least tentative of deployment of National Guard in Minneapolis. But of course, in Minneapolis, the National Guard were not deployed. They were projected to be deployed, but of course, DHS deployed other type of law enforcement agencies with the military capabilities and military tactics. So this would mean addressing a crisis which is set within the space of public safety with the military capabilities. And that is not unique to the US, it's not unique to South Africa. Let's travel a little bit to Haiti again. One of the worst scenarios in Haiti today is not just the state has failed, is that you have a rise of gangs in cities. And these gangs neutralize basically the lives of society. And for the very first time in the history of the United Nations, in the history of peace operations, the UN Security Council last year has passed a resolution of deploying peacekeepers in Haiti who will go and neutralize gangs, not neutralize in armed groups. So these gangs operate at the level of public safety, and yet the responses and the activities that we observe growing is the activities and capabilities of the military. Continuing this foreign policies and responses aspect, a few weeks ago we observed the trend of targeting and neutralizing the boats in the Latin America sections. And this boat was drug trafficking, projected to be drug trafficking. And within the framework of international peace and security, the level of neutralization is not based on the military capabilities. It's law enforcement activities, public safety issues. But the type of responses that we keep observing is that it's a response that is elevated at the national security crisis, national interest crisis, and requires military interventions. In many countries, using cases of Africa during elections, when the opposition protests, you will see that government tend to deploy the military, not the police, to neutralize the protesters. And there is no proportionality between the type of forces that are being deployed to neutralize peaceful, sometimes violent protesters with the tools that are being used. And within this conversation, you can tell that it's a growing trend, not only in so-called developing nations, but also in developed cities. And the idea here is to say the issue of public safety is no longer considered as an issue of just crimes, but it's an issue of existential crisis for many nations. So, but the framework at the international level that we have does not give us that possibility of saying or authorizing a country to use the military for public safety purposes. So, these four pillars, as I mentioned, education, justice, health, and public safety, are for me considered to be preventive measures, because once we have proper education system in place, formal and informal, once you have a functional justice system, and not only at the criminal justice level, but also at the social justice level, with fair redistribution of resources. And once you have a functional health system, and health system is not just about health care, but it's also a health system that can prevent and or address some issues of mental health and many others. And once you have a fair and safe public environment, then it's unlikely to see measures of instability occurring. But we have seen many of these because the approach to international stability has not covered this element. And these elements are internal, are social, are local. So, with that being said, my computer is, okay, great. So, some of the patterns that you have observed, I have mentioned some of them already. So why do we repeat the chaos again and again? So within the context of the UN systems is that crises look based on UN peace operation models. And these peace operation models are very kind of linear in their approach and based on policies. One, you have tension that arises, and this tension may be a frustration of basic social need not being met, or frustrations based on the fact that the politicians stay longer in power, and therefore the opposition does not have the space to express themselves, or frustration or tension based on just inter-ethnic conflict. So once you start observing that, unfortunately, by lack of preventive measures or advancement in neutralizing those or addressing those tensions, you have violence that erupts. And once those violences erupt, often we don't have a long-term plan on addressing them. We move to emergency responses. And these emergency responses at the institutional level is either negotiation or neutralizations, or at the humanitarian level, it's very much addressing humanitarian crisis. We have thousands of people being displaced from place A to place B. The emergency response, how can we create shelters? How can we make sure that there is no spread of certain diseases? But these emergency responses don't guarantee long-term stability and long-term restructurations of community. And there's a short-term approach when the patterns, or within this pattern of current UN peacekeeping operations, is that you have short-term stabilizations, relapse when institutions remain weak, and of course when that happens, so community experiences lack of protections as temporary and uneven. So technically the notions, in today's world you will hear more of this concept of protection of civilians in the UN jargon. So we want to protect civilians. Of course, we can protect them by giving shelters and providing A, B, and C, but the reality is that they are framed within a short-term approach. And this short-term approach projects a sense of protection, but does not guarantee long-term protection. So the rationality of what I consider has a gap here is that the resources flow to force posture during crisis. So in other words, we deploy forces quickly to address the crisis. But we don't mobilize resources for preventive measures, but we also don't mobilize resources for long-term transformation and development. Most of the resources that we develop or provide or collect are resources that are collected to address the emergency crisis. A few years ago, I think 3 years ago, I was leading a research team on the effectiveness of peacekeeping, and I worked on the UN transition team in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and wrote a report on it. And I was presenting then the work at the UN, and then they asked me a very valid and basic question is, do you think the UN should leave the DRC? I said, probably not now, but of course the UN has to leave. But if the UN leaves, the money should not leave. And the people are laughing, saying, how can you say that the UN should leave but not the money? And I'm like, here's the point. When we deploy in emergency situations, we mobilize serious resources. It's millions of dollars that are being mobilized. We neutralize the crisis. But the biggest work is in a post-conflict building process. And this is where people need more resources on building schools, more resources on addressing crimes that were occurring during crisis. But in the practice, unfortunately, of most of the UN approaches and international activities is that we come, we neutralize, and when we leave, of course, with our high-paid personnel and the money and the resources leaves, we say, okay, the country will get probably 50% of what we're providing in terms of budget. You probably have heard last week that there was this tent of crisis at the UN level where people say the UN is running out of money. And everyone was very concerned on the operational level of the UN. And of course, it's issues of budget. Money is always an issue. But when you think about this type of work, money should not be an issue. Especially in the long-term development programs, money should not be an issue. If you operate in short-term emergency cycle, yes, resources are important, but in the long-term approach, there should always be resources that enable institutions to develop and rebuild themselves. So in other words, it's a long-term planning. And the parenthesis here that I want to open, talking about resources, is that the lifespan of a refugee in the refugee camps is for how long? An estimated life of a person in a refugee camp. 20 years. 20 years, that's an average. But the type of responses when crises occur are short-term responses. So, and when people are in refugee camps, the idea from providers of help or assistance is that this is a short-term relief. We call them relief operations, right? It's a short-term relief. In other words, we provide funding, some support for 6 months, and then work on a new cycle of budget, probably another year or two. But the life of people in these places is 20 years. In other words, people living in refugee camp for 20 years on a relief support system. So how do you build and rebuild lives based on relief support system? That's a question mark I'm putting here in the point of reflections. That's why I'm saying when we talk about the preventive measures, one has to invest in the long term. When we think about the education cycle, from primary to college, we're talking about 18 years, right? 12, so from kindergarten probably to college, it's a trajectory of an estimate 16 to 18 years. But the type of interventions that we have are not interventions that provided that long-term planning and long-term perspectives. There is a need to rethink our peace-building strategies. So a rationale of these prevention measures, and I will go a little bit quickly on this, and then I want to open up more to the questions and the time of exchange. So you have 3 tiers developed recently by the UN when it comes to protection. The first one is called Tier 1, physical protection or reactive when needed. And this is physical protection is when, for instance, a crisis occurred and we have to deploy troops to patrol and address the crisis is Tier 1. So the use of force to neutralize, but also to address some of these crises. Tier 2, it's on dialogue and engagement, risk reduction. So this means negotiations and diplomacy. So if I feel like my student in class don't agree on some point, I'll create group work and have them talk to each other. So this is what's happening here. The state and international community create space of negotiations, try to reduce the risk of the crisis. So the escalation threat through mediation, negotiations, and community engagement. And Tier 3, which is protective environment. And this is where I focus my work, on protective environment. It's okay to bring everyday people around the table and have them talk. But that is just a conversation. How can you avoid this crisis? So you have to create a protective environment. And this protective environment focuses on preventive measures. So you have to build institutions and services that reduce vulnerability and disrupt escalation pathways. And this is where education comes in. This is where health comes in. Amartya Sen, who talks about development as freedom, talks about the basic human needs. He says if the basic human needs are not met, then the community and the people will get to the point of disrupting institutions. And for institutions to survive, and for us to talk about real freedom, is only when the basic human needs are met. And these basic are very much in their terms, basic. Water, shelter, electricity, and all these measures of safety. But you can tell that today the debates and discussions at the states, well, when I say states, I'm not referring to the U.S. framework, right, of state and federal, to the state as government level all around the world, is that we tend to focus on these economic indicators, GDPs, inflations, border securities, and great military capabilities. All these things are really good. Europeans are talking about it these days. African Union is talking about it. But the biggest question is, how do you ensure that your economic growth benefits the locals? How can you ensure that your economic growth and the resources that you mobilize are fairly distributed to address shortages of books in the very remote rural areas where you don't have proper infrastructures? These are basic questions, but also questions of preventive measures. This framework is as simple as that: justice, education, health, and public safety. But I want to touch on 2 things that are not highly discussed these days when you think about preventive measures and peace operations. And these are the 2 last bullet points, one on health and the second on public safety. Addressing trauma and survival and security. And the second is early warning and risk disruption. So addressing trauma and survival and security, the thing is that one cannot quantify trauma. You can have other quantitative measures of insecurity. So we patrol in this area. Of course, we had 10 people being killed last month. Today is only 2. So it looks like our policy and our strategies are effective. Why? Because it's quantitative indicators that we use. But how can you assess, for instance, the level of happiness? I know there is a student here at Salve, a doctoral student in humanities who is working on happiness, assessing and quantifying or reflecting on level of happiness. And it's so interesting because that is a non-quantifiable data. So how do you say that I live happy? If I'm happy now and then by driving out, I feel like I hate traffic and then I get upset. I'm like, no, not only traffic, I also need food. And then after that, it's like, no, it was not really bad. It was just one driver who did not have the right GPS and was trying to look left and right. And now the traffic is helping and I'm happy again. How can you quantify my level of happiness within a day? And the same thing comes with the issues of preventive measures, more specifically in post-conflict setup. How do you address this traumatic event and rebuild life of people who were killed or violated, raped during wars and moved away from their houses? How do you get to the point of addressing that in your peace building processes? These are things that are very much avoided. Why? Because they cannot be quantified. And because they cannot be quantified, the UN and other interveners cannot provide the right data saying we helped 15 people because they were frustrated yesterday and today they're happy. The issue of trauma is as important as peace building. The second element still under addressing trauma is at the military who were deployed in these types of crises. Post-traumatic syndromes. We see it and we observe it in many post-peacekeeping deployment. How do you address that in your troops? And then say, they want to build peace and they are also at peace. There is concept of protecting the protectors. How do we protect the peacekeepers? How do we protect the military? How do we protect the police who are deployed to protect civilians? Most of them will protect physically, but mentally they are destroyed. So if we have to rethink about rebuilding nations, we have to go through these processes and address these issues of trauma. Sometimes now the survival insecurity becomes that I would rather be in the gangs because that's where I'm expressing my level of freedom. I don't know if you see what I'm saying, right? That's where I'm expressing my level of freedom because if I have to follow the law, then the law will limit my expression of freedom. So in the peace building aspect, how can we rethink of recreating the same level of freedom that people were having when committing violence? And lastly is on the public safety measure, early warning and risk disruptions. At the preventive measure, we need to put in place early warning systems. When we see things starting building up, we can tell that it's about to get worse. And with my student, especially today, we're talking about what we think could happen, for instance, in the Middle East. And by just seeing the mobilization of troops here and there, that's at the military level. But also, you can tell since the past 3 weeks, many civilian airlines were asked either to cancel the trips to Israel and other places. So when you look at the European airlines flying over the Middle East, and then you start observing some certain disruptions and cancellations, and they tell you that this airspace is not open today. Of course, they might not tell that something on the security front is being developed, but for someone who does work on these spaces, you can tell that by putting things together, you have a huge deployment of the US here, you have a mobilization on the European countries when it comes to military capabilities, and the civilian airlines are either reducing their flight in these particular regions, then you can tell that, okay, what's going on in this particular region at the security level. So these are tools that one can use by mobilizing them and then telling, for instance, the Iranians that this is not a joke. We need to get to the table and negotiate. So the early warning signals can be just as a mobilization of troops. Now, move it from a state level to local communities. When you see that the red light, our signals, on our streets are not working every day, there are disruptions. At the community level, we can anticipate and then say, for the next 3 days, if these are not fixed, we can have some accident, right? Incident on the street. It's as basic as that. So now when you think about them from the security and protection perspective, these tools need to be put in place. And for them to be put in place, we have to understand that they cannot be standardized. They are community specific. Each community deserves their own approaches. And here I will just, wrap up with this and then give a quick example on current affairs and open up to conversations. I keep insisting on this because I think they are tools for long-term stability and peacebuilding. What are the measures that can be addressed? And then I say we have to be very much practical. And when you think about justice, think about access to justice. The distance that we have from here, sometimes, when you're in the US and Western countries, it's much easier to say, well, I'm just driving down to the court, right? I can see the lawyer, the judges here. But you have places where for you to see a judge, you have to be distant. You have to drive. For you to have a lawyer, it's another story by itself, and a fair one. So access to justice becomes an important element. So how often can you access the legal system and institutions? How much does it cost to have a lawyer? It was so interesting. I was living in South Africa, and there was this interesting, way of thinking about legal insurance and car insurances. And then they will be doing an ad saying, showing someone who got hit into an accident or something like that, or hit someone, and then when it comes and they're trying to address them, they say, don't talk to me, talk to my lawyer. So you have to pay for insurance, right? For your legal insurance, as we pay for car insurance here. So I started telling my siblings, if I know that I messed up, I'll be like, don't talk to me, talk to my lawyer. And talk to my lawyer. But for you to talk to my lawyer, I have to make sure that I have the resources to pay for legal services. And this is what I'm talking about here. So access to justice is not just about having the justice system in place, but also having the means, ensuring that people have the means to afford the justice system. Think about cases throughout and backlog reductions. If you think in the US with the immigration system we have a backlog, think it again through. If you ask Uncle Google, how long is the backlog for permanent resident from Indian descent in the US, for them to become just a permanent resident in the US? Their wait in the system can be between 15 to 20 years. That's how long is the backlog. So that is just an immigration setup, right? But you are in certain countries where someone is incarcerated and it takes forever to be seen by a judge. And that person will remain in detention for years and years. And if we have to talk about justice, we have also to think about the availability of judges, but also how fast the cases are being addressed throughout the system. And the last point here is the perceived fairness. Who trusts the justice system in a crisis setting? How do you trust that this system is fair? If the judge was an advisor to the minister and an advisor to a president who committed crime and led the country to a crisis, would I trust the judge? If I don't trust the judge, then I don't think I would trust the justice system that judge project. So these are some elements of crisis that we observed in so many of these crises and need to be addressed technically and with accuracy. We have to evaluate the outcome of our interventions. I'm teaching a course on complex humanitarian interventions, and one of the books that we use is on how interventions or how humanitarian aid create more harm than good. The point here is to say, if we think about interventions, we have to think about effective interventions. Are we at a stage where our nations and our communities can say we are moving, or we have moved from crisis response to preventive measures? If we are not, what can be done? And I'll say we have to think about the framework of interventions. We have to think about the leadership of these interventions, but we also have to think about the resources of these interventions. So with that being said, I'll stop here and I'll be happy to entertain questions and conversations and maybe to provide additional stories. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now is the time for questions. While people are thinking, I have questions. Dr. Ilunga, I could not help but, and you addressed it directly, think about the U.S. And the current state of sort of the, as we watch sort of the disintegration of some of our public institutions and the backsliding, democratic backsliding. Does your framework, in terms of measuring prevention, are there ways that we could apply it here to address some of the issues, the same issues that you addressed that we are seeing here that you may also see in countries that you worked in?
Yes. Yeah, definitely the framework should be is applicable here. And I'll use a practical example. The US is one of the few developed countries with the highest level of mental health crisis. Yeah, a mental health crisis, not a good one. So by that itself tells you what comes with an uncontrolled outcomes of mental health crisis. It's crimes and many other things. So if we have to think, this dimension of health should be considered. And not only on the health side, it's also a country with the most expensive healthcare system in the world. So affording it is a privilege. So the public system, the public healthcare system here is, I don't think it's funded enough. It's probably underfunded compared to the need of the people and the ratio of the people, right? So having an expensive healthcare system with limited state intervention into them fragilizes local institutions and local entities. Two, think about the public health, the public schooling system in some places here. It's only in the US where I heard for the very first time that you need to find a good place to stay based on your zip code so that your kid can go to the good school. So that means the level of investment in public school is also not proportional. So because of that, of course, one can say it's a social dynamic, but it's also a long-term element of fragility. On your introduction, you said I grew up in a mining city. Yes. And I went into schools that were run by mining companies. So those schools were a little bit well-funded because the mining companies had enough resources to invest in buildings, invest in infrastructures, in libraries, and pay well the teachers. You had other non-mining company-related schools, but which were still very much public schools. They did not have the same privilege. And you can tell that from the output of education, there was a disparity. So, and that reinforces social inequality in the long term. So, is this applicable in the US? I think yes. Can we avoid it? Definitely yes, we can, if the right resources are equally and fairly distributed in places where there is need. On the public safety measures, I did a couple of research, and then I visited and lived in two major states cities, so capitals. So Albany and Trenton. Albany in New York and Trenton in New Jersey. I was doing some research on why there is high level of crimes in these places. The reality was, in Trenton, New Jersey, where you have state facilities, you had commuters, workers. Everyone who, at least the majority, works for the states will commute in and out. And during the late afternoon, it's an empty place with almost no enough economic activities to sustain communities. And that creates a rise of crimes. Albany is another case. If you travel to Albany, New York, you near the University of New York University and the law school, you can see there is a huge neighborhood with, I don't know if last year or so they have changed them, with unoccupied housings as a result of 2008 and then crisis. In those areas are also areas of high crime. So the point here is to say yes, it's applicable in the US, and you can tell just from the safety purposes, from safety measures, there are certain trends. In many high crime communities are also low economic communities. So you have that proportionalities. And lastly, maybe on, so I talked about education, I talked about health and the justice system. I think we all can tell that I've been in different countries, but it's only in the US where I can tell that the judge is politically appointed. So it's the administration or the president or whoever who appoint a judge. And then we've heard the narrative saying this is a Republican judge, this is a Democrat judge. How can I trust the justice system if the judge comes with an affiliation, political affiliations? But somewhere else is not the case. For someone to be a judge, even in many other developing countries, of course there is always political interferences, but in some other places, someone would be like a professional diplomat, a professional judge who started at a low level, grew up to become that high professional judge. If they become corrupt, that's another conversation. But the appointment is not a political appointment. So in the case of the US, I think we need to rethink about this. The output of the justice system is another conversation, but the establishment of the justice system and the runners of this justice system need to be reflected, because it doesn't make sense. Sorry, I'm passionate about this. It doesn't make sense to have a judge who is appointed because you're an independent, because you're a Democrat, because you're a Republican. So what does that mean in your ruling? If that requires to go against the line of your own political parties. And these are institutional and systemic issues that need to be reflected upon. And I think it goes deeper than just having someone standing there. So the framework, while the US is not at the level of chaos, it can avoid it by rethinking the system that we have in place. And that just requires, to be honest, bold steps, unconventional moves, to say enough is enough. We see where we're going. We can crash. Let's rethink. Let's address this. Yes.
Yvan, I really enjoyed your talk, and I apologize, I showed up a little bit late, so you may have addressed this. But when you were talking about the importance of planning ahead and thinking about the long term as opposed to just reacting from a government point of view in terms of crisis management versus long-term sustainability and health, I kept thinking of the Winston Churchill quote that, democracy is the worst form of government except for others that have been tried before. I was joking, but, most of us are committed to democracy. But I think one of its strengths is reacting to the will of the people at a certain moment. But in the U.S. and probably in other countries, you have election cycles in and out, and some of the things you're talking about are, decades, potentially centuries long. So I don't know what the question is there, but are there ways for political leaders who maybe feel pressure to appoint a judge, for example, from a political party, or do other things that are short-term in nature, to be incentivized to think long-term? Because it seems like that's difficult. It's a difficult sell in a democracy to say, we're doing something now that's going to pay off in the long term. That's a big question with probably not an easy answer.
Yeah, great. I agree that political leaders need to think long term. It's unfortunate that democracy, which was a system of long-term sustainability, has become a practice of short-term planning. And it's very much around self-interest rather than the reasoning of why we have democratic system today, which was very much based on social contract. And social contract in the States processes and building projected long term. Sometimes I question myself and I challenge myself and my student, say, do you think, not dictatorship, maybe let's say dictatorship by default, a non-democratic system of non-election is a good system? Because at sometimes we see consistencies in those countries. Let's just be practical with China. The reason why China has seen major changes on the economic performances is also due to the fact that they don't have 4-year cycle of elections. You have one leader, if they happen to be visionary and they stay a little bit longer, they implement their programs. But unfortunately in democratic systems, that is a cap. Every 4 years or 7 or 8 years, you have to rethink, and therefore you work probably for only 6 if you are in a 7 terms type of things, and the last year is not even the year of output, it's a year of campaign. And the people will wait until the potential next comes in. So yes, I think this is where the politics and policies should be, to some extent, separated. The politics is a cycle of representations and activities and leadership, but policies, I think, is a cycle of impact and processes. And if we have policies that project transformations, it doesn't matter if we have a leader who comes in for 4 years, but if these policies are well grasped and understood by the majority, they will run with them throughout. Maybe a practical example is the curriculums in schools, right? If a department has a set curriculum, it doesn't matter who comes in as the department chair. The curriculum is set to run for a long time. And of course we can review it here and there, but we still have a clear mind saying this is political science curriculum. I use much concerns for my case. And we run with it because it is a set of policies, sets of arrangement with clear projected output. And I think that can also apply at the government level. But unfortunately, democracy these days has become a tool for political gain and positioning within the short-term windows of opportunity that one get. Yes. Thank you.
Hi. Well, I guess my question is this transferable when it comes to like this framework being transferable to nations that are not quite free in some sense? Because as a state, say you are technically and legally free, but I've done a lot of, this is kind of what I'm focusing on now, the idea of like the intervention of, for example, the UN or the World Bank and all these development programs that come with, you know, their strings attached and their austerity policies, and how usually the first things to go are education and health, public safety, all of these measures. But now it's on the state, usually it's, you know, the division of global north and south. You have the countries in the global south that are technically free, but not really. It falls like these, I guess, this track, these tiers of action really fall in the hands of the global north or whoever is in the position of the money. How can this be transferable to the nations that are not quite free in how they operate?
Great. I'm glad you mentioned free on how to operate, because I was also thinking about freedom at the level of governance system, and I wanted to use a practical case of which has become now a very unstable country, Libya. During Gaddafi, he had a great investment in education, great investment in health and public safety and security in general, and very much justice system. So under dictatorship, but the country was performing well until the waves of democracy came in. Then today, Libya is completely unstable. So for me, that is a global South country that demonstrated the stability of this framework, and they used it well with leadership that understood that they needed to provide for their people. Of course, there were many reasons for providing. There is a theory saying dictators provide all this so that they avoid uprising. Yes, but still they provide. So why would I have a free leader who does not provide and push for democracy? But on the IMF level, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, in early 90s, you had what is known as the structural adjustment policies, asking many developing countries to shift their focus from social investments to the macroeconomic type of investments, and you have to build up your GDP. Once that is built up, then you can have enough resources to redistribute those resources in your community. And therefore, for you to do that, you have to cut on social spending, you have to cut on health, you have to cut on education, and many other things, public transportations. So, but the reality is that these countries continue to suffer Because you cannot build a long-term sustainable economy with a poor long-term education system. So you have to build the education system. And I think we are in a space where this developmental framework needs to be revisited, and the shift needs to occur. The macroeconomic approach did not work for many countries. At the UN level, you had two of them in the past 26 years. One is the Millennium Development Goals, starting in 2000, with the idea of reducing poverty, investing in education. In 2015, we moved into the Sustainable Development Goals and saying everyone now needs to invest in this, including climate change and all those type of things. But until you address the leadership level, you think of uniqueness and originality in each of these countries. When it comes to the governance system and strategies, you're still having the same cycle. Because I grew up, again, I insist, in a mining city. The investment and were very much geared toward training people to be in the technical setup, kind of engineers and math and everything. So literature was not part of it. Forget about agriculture. But the reality is that the DRC as a country today realizes that the second biggest long-term economic area, a domain where they need to invest, is in agriculture. But for many years they have not invested in agriculture because of this one-sided approach on economic investment. You have critical minerals, build on it, sell it to Europe, and you get the expensive watches and necklaces that you cannot afford. And this is the dependency theory you're talking about. And I think we need to really reframe and rethink. And not only that, Côte d'Ivoire with the cacao and all the sort of things, they get the big box, send it to France, France get it, put in dark chocolate, and then when you send it back to Côte d'Ivoire, no one can afford that French-based dark chocolate. But they worked on tons of it for $50. But they cannot afford just a bar of it on $10. So I think this demand and invite for many global South countries, more specifically African countries, there is this idea of Africa is rising, African solutions to African issues. It's not just on the security, it's also on the economic level. And is that a trend? Probably not yet, but at least there are conversations here and there thinking to address governance differently. In the global north, think about the NATO conversations. Europe today is also thinking about their own security framework. The US is thinking about its own security framework. Latin America is thinking. So there is a growing change, and we have to appreciate it. I think the danger is that if we don't appreciate the uniqueness of it, we will end up having a standardized global approach that will not help again. So that is the point.
I wondered if you had any advice for, if we're going back to the practical, applicable side of this, for the students, faculty, and staff in this audience about what we can do to implement these, enact this.
That's a huge responsibility to advise people. But I think I would just say one thing here is that peace is not institutional, peace is human. So we can work hard on building institutional peace, stability that we provide and we see. But until we start addressing peace at the human level, we will be failing ourselves. So it's important to understand that once people are at peace and have peace, then institutions and nations will know peace. But if we want to build institutions, well, we want to avoid crises that build institutions. We've seen the trend again and again that has failed in many countries. So my humble advice is to say instability, when it occurs at the states, national, international level, is just a reflection of instability in human and individual level, at a very basic level. Family, local communities. And if we start addressing those, we can do better, and we can maybe not change the world, but we can change our neighborhood. I told once, I said, it's amazing to see these big non-for-profit organizations with multi-million dollars in New York developing programs of helping homelessness in certain countries. But when they come out of their home offices, next door is the homeless sleeping there. So it doesn't make sense. Why would you be here, build a multi-million dollars plan to go help an unknown, which is good, but the homeless that you know every single day has no shelter, no water, and nothing, and you cannot do that, and you want to save the world? Let's save our streets, and then the world will also be saved. That will be my advice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And please join us for snacks and more discussion. And thank you so much for sharing your research.